Welcome to AP Human Geography. Today we're going to go ahead and talk about some world migration. So we'll look at the different patterns from around the world, where people have gone to, where they've come from, the source, and the destination. Whenever we're measuring the likelihood of places to interact, this introduces us to a model from this unit, the gravity model, um, which talks about the larger and the closer places are, they're more likely are to attract one another than places that are further apart and smaller. So we talked about with Ravenstein's laws of migration. You're going to be more attracted to a big city. You're going to be more attracted to economic opportunities in those areas. You're also going to be more likely to travel shorter distances. So what we see here is when you have a longer distance, as long as it's a larger place, then you're more likely to be attracted there. So larger and closer places are going to attract more than smaller and more distant places. So you can have a longer distance, but also a large place, and you can overcome some of these things. So we'll talk about and it talks about the different things of spatial interaction, how migration is going to work, and how the relationship between population and distance. You can see an inverse relationship here, and we'll talk about this formula of the distance between two places and how you can look at the population. And even though it's far enough away, if you have two large populations, that's still going to have the type of spatial interaction that you're looking for. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the gravity model. But if we talk about the migration peoples, we're going to talk about it in different realms. We have the prehistoric migrations, the typical European migration to the Americas, the diaspora from Africa, Europe to Asia and Oceania, Europe to Africa, and then what's going on contemporarily today. So let's get into the history of world migration. Again, you go back to your early middle school classes, your early history classes, and you've seen the ancient movements of different locations. We'll talk about some of these next unit when we get into language, when we talk about Angles, Jutes, and Saxons. Here you can see, again, the Goths and the Vandals and the Huns, all these different types of movements that took place in a lot of your early migration patterns and a lot of the history of the Eastern Roman Empire here. Then we look at all these different migrations here. We talk about um, crossing the Bering Strait. You talk about this as you're growing up in all your early history classes. We saw the growth there. We see the growth across Africa, and Africa making its way into the continent of Eurasia, and the movement there and what has happened in those locations. So these are your early historic and prehistoric migrations. When we start getting into, again, where do Europeans start to move? We see this early on with the Age of Exploration. Go into 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. Well, that's not the only place that they're sailing and that they're going. And again, we're traveling more than just by the ocean, but we're traveling throughout Europe. They're going across Asia looking for trade routes, going into Africa, and then we start to expand it. And then when they get into the African slave trade and different types of movements. So where are Europeans going? Well, they're going to take them there. Then you're going to see the colonization of different locations. And where do we colonize? Well, we go into the Asian regions of the world. We go make some connections in North America, South America, Africa, and obviously even Australia. And we talk about the African diaspora. And again, becomes the dispersal of the African population. A lot of this through different regions of Africa, but the most well known of all this is obviously going to be the African slave trade. This major diaspora that we start to see, that we really start to see the movement out of Western Africa into different regions around the world, especially we know the movement into the Americas. And so again, as we see this, we see contemporary and different movements. You've seen these historical examples. So let's talk about this modern timeline. So if we talk about the migration around the world before 1500, all right, before 1500, there really was no rhyme or reason to a lot of the colonization, a lot of movement. There really wasn't colonization that we know it the way we do now. It was a lot of more haphazard and just as a matter of fact, hey, let's find some places. And they would go and they would find some routes and looking for fame. All right, God, gold, and glory in some regards will come later on. When we talk about spices and fame and exploration, just the travel portion. Then we get into that age of exploration, all right, the 1500s to 1800s, where the Europeans will colonize not just the Americas, but Africa and different parts of Asia, which we've seen in some of the earlier maps. Then we get into 1900s, where they're done with the colonization in the Western Hemisphere and they're kind of kicked out of the Western Hemisphere. And when you get into things like the Monroe Doctrine and that type of stuff, you'll understand that. But what we see in the 18 and 1900s, that's where you see the European colonization of Africa and Asia. We'll talk about this again in further future units. Then you get to the 1900s to the present. We talk about World War One and World War II and how they play a large role in the migration patterns that have taken place throughout the world, and then even into the contemporary issues that we see today. So if we look at the world migration patterns and what's looking like today, it kind of goes with what you guys kind of saw when you did your look at the waves of migration for the United States. Well, we see it in different parts around the world too, because it's not just migration to the United States, but you have international migration all over. So here's some of your major patterns we're going to see that get back to the discussion of emigration and immigration. We see that Asia, Latin America, and Africa all have net out migration. Again, if you've got net out migration, it means you're more likely to leave an area going somewhere else. Then we talk about North America and Europe and Oceania. They're going to have net in migration. All right, more likely to move into an area, more incorporated there, more developed, more opportunities there. Then Asia. All right, we're going to see Asians are going to migrate to places like Europe and North America. All right, we've seen that again as well with some other locations. South Americans are going to tend to migrate to North America. Again, the proximity will play a role there. And then Africa will tend to migrate to Europe. And if you look at the proximity, we talked about it, especially what they'll do is they'll migrate up to Northern Africa. And then from Northern Africa, they'll make their way in, whether they have to go across through Turkey and through the Eurasian connection, or you go up like through Morocco, up through Spain, and even up into France, right down there across the Mediterranean Sea. Those are some of the things that we see and some of the things that we're able to pick up on as we see current migration patterns. So if we talk about this and you think about this, again, who's going to have the in migration, who's going to have the out migration, these are some of the things that we see these trends when it comes to the MDC and LDC regions of the world. Well, what that leads to is, what are your controversies? What happens when we have all these different types of migration? What does this lead to? All right, if we're having to take care of migration, all these different patterns, what are some problems that can be caused by it? What happens if you have these migrants coming in and it's not the real legal process? What is the unintended consequence? And by getting people here, is it a melting pot or is it cultural mosaic? Is it a salad bowl? There are all these different references as to what it looks like when you get everybody all together from different cultures and different ethnicities. When we talk about migration patterns and the trends around the different times, again, some of the ones that we've seen, some of the major patterns as we look around the world, all right, from many parts of Southeast Asia and Asia, moving into the Middle East, economic opportunities here, moving out of Eastern Asia and Southeastern Asia, going to the United States, all right, for economic opportunity, again, towards the West Coast. Then you see, again, coming from some previous patterns from South America, making their way into Japan. We also see some that will come, obviously, through Latin America, all the way up through to the United States. And then, obviously, we talked about our European and Asian migration, obviously, into parts around Europe throughout the European Union. So when we talk about this international migration, again, we get into the laws of migration and where are you most likely to migrate? Well, you're going to more likely be migratory to places that you're more familiar with. We've seen, again, in the United States, most well-known states that are known for having large numbers of immigrants. Well, we got California up here, you got Texas down here, Florida, and then obviously we make our way up here, Ellis Island, get all the way up to New York. So these are just some of the things that we'll be able to see and that we do have an opportunity to understand. So when we talk about these, some of these are going to be regionally linked, and a lot of it's going to be linked for these short-term economic opportunities. We've talked about guest workers in many different places around the world, and not only for guest workers, but we're going to see refugees. We've talked about refugees several times already. We've done some activities with that. And then just reconnection, all right, trying to get back to your homeland, which we'll talk about a lot of these things a little bit more in future units. This is just kind of serving as your introduction to it. So we talk about these islands of development, in which we can talk about more in Unit 6 in the coming future. But what we see is there's opportunities in other parts around the world. So where are we going to go? All right, what's the location? Well, we talk about the migration in LDCs in these parts. The migration is going to be into these urban areas because it's the only real part that can that can thrive economically for some of these LDCs and regions like that. Again, we see it migrating throughout different parts of Asia when you see the major movement into different regions. around the world. Some of it trying to flee a communist type regime that was going on in China, but also moving out into more economic opportunities throughout Southeast Asia when you get down into Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, and throughout that region. And then we see the cultural groups in the movement trying to find that Zionist movement, trying to, where's your homeland? We go into the Holocaust, and then we talk about Zionism and the creation of a Jewish homeland when we see the creation of Israel. And then we start to see discussions here, which we'll come back and talk about again in future units as we see why these migratory patterns occur, what conflicts occur because of it. So again, just an example here of what happens when we do run into some migration issues and what some of the flows will become. But what we can see is some of the major patterns. If we go back and think about it, some of the links and some of the patterns, you're going to see net out migration from a lot of these LDC regions and net in migration from these regions around the world that are more likely to be MDCs and more developed. So if we look at these, and again, we talk about net migration and net migratory population, and what we're going to see again, net in migration, we're noticing in some more developed areas of the world for sure. All right. What we're also going to be able to see is we're going to notice net out migration from some areas that may struggle or be not have as much availability of economic opportunity, but even cultural opportunities. So we see places like this, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. For some of us, it doesn't make sense, but if we understand economically what's there, we understand that's going to be an in migration pull. And so we look at this around the world and we think about this, kind of reiterating everything we've talked about 3% of the world's population are your international migrants. All right. Much of the rest of it's going to be your natural growth, birth rate, death rate, getting into all that stuff. But 3% of the world's population will be focused on what we see here when it comes to the migratory population. The United States, we have the largest number of volume of immigrants. Southwest Asia, we talk about the Middle East, they are going to have the largest percentage, all right, with the UAE in particular having the highest percentage of immigrants there. And that's because of the draw of the economic opportunities that will be there. Then we talk about a global scale. Again, Asia, Africa, Latin America are going to have out migration. We've talked about that. And obviously, they're not as developed, so they're not going to be as attractive of an area to be. They're going to try to find opportunities, which is where people would go to with North America, Europe, and even parts of Oceania for Australia and New Zealand and places like that. They will have the in migration where LDCs are going to try to move to these MDCs. So again, number one reason that we talk about with economic opportunities, that's the number one reason people move. All right, their number one reason people are going to move is for economic reasons. And that is why MDCs are going to have an advantage of net in migration versus an LDC and what they would. So that brings you to the end of what we're going to talk about here when we talk about world migration. Hopefully, you have a good understanding. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know and we'll go from there. Have a great day.